I watched Marvel's Loki Season 1 a few years ago when it was first released. I thought the overall production was better than a lot of other streaming shows. But to be honest, I had no interest in revisiting Loki again, or other Marvel streaming series for that matter. This past Christmas, however, I put on Loki Season 2 during some downtime, and I'm glad I did. I enjoyed it a lot more than I thought I would. I've never read any Marvel comics, so I'm not familiar with any of the characters or stories the show might be based on. And despite this series being based on pre-existing intellectual property, there seemed to be a clear voice behind the project. Plus, I love the soundtrack by composer Natalie Holt. It wasn't until the finale that I realized this show is relevant to this channel. I was surprised to find that imagery and themes used in Loki actually point to some esoteric ideas that I have been circling around. The finale's climactic sequence had me looking back and recontextualizing the whole show. To my surprise, this specific Loki storyline, starting with Thor 1 to Avengers 1 through to the Loki series Season 2 finale, touches on esoteric themes of alchemical transformation. And I'm referring to both C.G. Jung's psychological alchemy, like I discussed in my previous video on Nosferatu, but also more esoteric ancient mystery traditions closely related to alchemical practices. So in this video, I'll be using the Loki series as a jumping-off point to discuss some of the ideas I've been contemplating this past year. I was actually working on this Loki video script when Egger's Nosferatu came along to divert my attention. I ended up using a few of the ideas I intended for this discussion of Loki in the Nosferatu video. So, to hopefully avoid too much repetition, this video will be a sort of continuation of that analysis, even though it's not the same media that I'm structuring the conversation around. I'll do my best to move quickly over any points already covered, and I'll place both videos into a playlist. Perhaps this through line will continue into future videos. This may sound absurd, and it definitely is absurd, but I think this Disney Plus Marvel Loki streaming series tells a sci-fi fairy tale of alchemical transformation, not just in the psychological sense of Jungian individuation, and not just in the sense of spiritual redemption, but alchemy as alchemical deification, the process in which an individual comes to realize and become the divine. Some of this seems intentional and deliberate, like the character of OB, but I think a lot of the broader resonance with ancient mystery traditions is probably shaped by the unconscious. I guess if you YouTube long enough, you end up dedicating an entire video to Disney intellectual property. In making Loki, Disney was in a way engaging in a well-worn trope to extend the value of their intellectual property. Disney has a habit of taking villains and making them into heroes. Although in Loki, cynicism aside, I think the series was pretty well done, and his redemption arc is very well executed and earned. In this video, I'll discuss the Loki series via a Marie-Louise von Franz style analysis. This analysis will not look at or consider comic book narratives or prior comic book versions of these characters, and I'm specifically discussing the Loki arc that starts with Thor 1, continues into Avengers 1, then plays out in Loki Season 1, and ends in Season 2. According to an interview with Tom Hiddleston, it seems that Loki's MCU adventures will continue in future projects. But for the purposes of this video, let's just pretend Loki's MCU narrative ends with the Season 2 finale. This would be a very fitting farewell to the character. I hope that I'll get across why I think the series is an alchemical tale of deification, a narrative that resonates in the heart of any mystic. Loki begins the streaming series as a villain just recently defeated. But, as viewers, we know that the so-called sacred timeline Loki, the Loki we've seen in various Marvel films, dies a somewhat inglorious death. At the beginning of the Loki series, viewers are revisiting a character who for all intents and purposes has died. While we all know that comic books tend to revive characters, for a moment at least, fans grieved his death, and yet here he is again. But this is not the exact same character we followed throughout the MCU sacred timeline. In the streaming series, Loki finds himself on a very different level of existence. He is now in a realm outside of the normal laws of time and space. The way I see it, all of Loki's exploits in the TVA are an afterlife journey of transformation. What ancient cultures would call an underworld journey, a descent, a catabasis. The production has the veneer and ornamentation of science fiction. Science fiction and esotericism have a history of going hand in hand. but it would be too much of a digression to get into that. I will say, one plot point in Loki Season 1, the idea that someone can repeatedly hide within apocalypses covering their trail, was something I heard years ago from sci-fi-inspired psychedelic psychonaut Terence McKenna. But I digress. At its core, I think the streaming series Loki is an underworld story. This is an afterlife journey for both Loki as Marvel's corporate intellectual property, and for the character of Loki within the MCU's ever-expanding narrative. This story resonates with mythology used during ancient mystery cult rituals. Richard Seaford gave a basic definition of what a mystery cult ritual was all about on the popular Secret History of Western Esotericism podcast. It was a very wide range of phenomenon in Greco-Roman antiquity. There are many different cultures in the ancient Mediterranean that contribute to what are called mystery cults. In particular, cults joining together fusing between Asian cults and Greek cults. An interesting form of mystery cult is a ritual which people undergo a rehearsal of death in order to obtain eventually a better fate in the next world. And these types of mysteries with death and rebirth practices seem to have been greatly influenced by the ancient Egyptian religion. I think this is a way of understanding the journey that Loki undertakes in the series. At the beginning of the series, Loki enters a limbo state of existence, which in many ways serves as purgatory. He is forcibly pushed through a door of light, which is a very common near-death experience trope. He is then literally put to judgment, a la ancient traditions, like the weighing of the heart in Egyptian belief. Loki undergoes a life review where he sees his entire life and is asked to reflect on it. Life reviews are another common near-death experience trope. Loki is guided by what the ancients called a psychopomp, a mythological role arguably going back into prehistory. This is an underworld figure who shows one the ropes, so to speak. For Loki, that's Mobius. The very name Mobius refers to the idea of a timeless infinity. The Klein bottle is created by combining two Mobius strips. In a previous video, I shared musings on how I think the Klein bottle can be a teaching device for understanding the relationship between yin and yang. The Time Variance Authority, the TVA, is structured like a literal physical maze. It has long winding hallways and sharp turns. It also acts like a bureaucratic maze as well. In the series, Loki straddles the line between being and non-being. He lives in a beyond state after death, and he often faces the prospect of the void, which means losing what remains of his being in a state of non-being. These are themes that strike at the heart of the ancient Greek practice of philosophy, a practice of loving and honoring wisdom, who was personified as a female goddess. Plato, arguably the single most influential thinker in all of so-called Western civilization, referred to philosophy as a preparation for death, and said becoming godlike was the goal. And something that is not appreciated enough is that followers of Orpheus, Pythagoras, Empedocles, and Plato regarded their philosophical tradition as a mystery into which one might be initiated. In my view, Loki's adventures in the TVA constitute such an initiation into mystery. As I've previously discussed on this channel, particularly in the Twin Peaks series, the underworld and its mysteries can be understood through the lens of C.G. Jung's concept of the unconscious. As they fleshed out their theories of the unconscious and ways to properly communicate these ideas, Jung and his protégé Marie-Louise von Franz studied underworld narratives commonly found in antiquity's mystery cult traditions. So when you look at Jung's process of individuation, his paradigm for healing, you'll find markers and dynamics quite similar to mystery cult narratives. And I think Loki's journey bears the marks of Jungian individuation. Individuation is generally understood as the process of becoming fully realized as a human being. Individuation is not the process of creating a social identity. That's the job of ego and persona formation, which occurs during our upbringing within the status quo. During Loki's adventures in this afterlife existence, Loki progresses from egotistical narcissist villain to a caring person capable of carrying a heavy burden for those he loves. In my previous video, I discussed how Jung and Marie-Louise von Franz used the language of alchemy to describe the individuation process, and Loki is jam-packed with alchemical symbolism, marking Loki's process of individuation. In this video, I won't walk through all the alchemical stages of Jung's process like I did before, But I would like to briefly discuss how the Loki series touches on core aspects of Jung's psychology using this helpful table I found online, thanks to whoever created it. First, we have the persona, the mask we all wear. Loki's mask is that of an overconfident, arrogant, power-hungry prince, someone who takes everything in stride, someone who makes snide remarks while constantly scheming to increase his social status and power. In a way, Loki literally wears a mask all the time. He hides the fact that deep inside he is a frost giant, an alien that would not be accepted by his society. The reality that Loki isn't Asgardian by birth, but was born a sworn enemy of Asgard, speaks to the shadow darkness that Loki is hiding beneath his persona. The darkness which clings to every personality is the door into the unconscious and the gateway of dreams, from which those two twilight figures, the shadow and the anima, step into our nightly visions. I've used this quote in several videos, but time and time again, it proves useful. If you're ever in doubt whether you're in an underworld unconscious state, it might be helpful to look for the markers of the shadow and the anima to help situate yourself. The shadow represents the undesirable aspects of one's personality, aspects cut out of our manufactured societal mask. These traits over time assert their influence, often dominating one's behavior without us being conscious of it. Loki runs into shadow selves in the form of doppelgangers. One doppelganger in particular, widely used in marketing for Season 1, puts on display the cringe-worthy aspects of Loki's desperate need for worldly power and adoration. As Loki slowly gains perspective on himself throughout this individuation process, he begins to understand that his power and status-seeking behaviors are a farce he no longer wants to engage in, and he eventually learns that he has a desperate need for love, validation, and connection. But this particular doppelganger is but one shadow figure amongst many variants that Loki encounters, and he doesn't play a substantial role in the narrative. Once Loki begins to care about the greater good in a more genuine sense, I think he who remains functions as the primary shadow figure that Loki needs to contend with. I'll get to that later when things get a bit weirder. The game changer for Loki is meeting and making a genuine connection with his female variant Sylvie. Sylvie is a pretty blatant anima figure in some respects. She's literally meant to be Loki in the form of a woman. The name Sylvie has ties to traditions of a woodland goddess. In Season 1, we see that the bond that forms between the male and female Lokis has the potential to transform the cosmos in ways no one has seen before. Their moment by the lake is Mysterium Conjunctionis, a transforming of the cosmos through the unification of the opposites, the anima and the animus. They become what Jung and esoteric traditions call the syzygy. I think this deep bond to Sylvie leads Loki to become fully individuated in the Jungian sense. If not for Sylvie serving as his conscience and as his pathway to empathy, care, and compassion for others, Loki would not become fully realized and ultimately deified at the end of the series. I think the series does this in a creative manner without relying on some of the usual cliché anima imagery, for example, the sort of imagery David Lynch liked to toy around with. Sylvie doesn't fit the mold of a sultry woman in red or anything like that, but she does provide Loki and others, like B-15, with a clearer view of reality. She allows Loki to feel something, true empathy and connection, which itself is an expression of the so-called feminine principle. Through this relationship, Loki finds his ability to love others more than himself, to appreciate community, wanting to see it grow and thrive. And when Loki finds that he needs to make a decision that affects all of existence, that he has the opportunity to take ultimate power, Loki refuses to do the easy thing, which would probably be to kill Sylvie and salvage what's left of the cosmic order imposed by he who remains. But Loki's bond with Sylvie opened his heart, and it leads to love and appreciation for Mobius and the TVA crew. This is the quintessential work of the anima. In the final 2 episodes of Season 2, we see Loki go through a Groundhog's Day-like gauntlet, reliving the same day over and over in order to learn everything he possibly can to salvage the status quo. But no matter what Loki does here, no matter how much knowledge and information he's filled his head with, no matter how much time he adds to the exercise, the status quo is doomed to fail. It is a structure that cannot hold. In this flurry of desperation and activity, Loki gets caught up in heroic, forceful, so-called masculine, or yang energy. He will save the day if he tries hard enough. By using his intellect, he will figure it out. Loki thinks that adding more time, more effort, more thought will solve the problem. But he's wrong. Like Dale Cooper getting lost in the Black Lodge, there's no way out of this purgatory state. If you keep trying to solve the maze with clever heroics, you end up right back where you started. Sylvie, as Anima, who might seem so stubborn and irrational on the surface, is right. The status quo cannot continue as is. She understands that the Kafkaesque misery that is the TVA cannot continue in its current form. Throughout the series, Sylvie rebels against the banal evil of the TVA, an organization operating through bureaucratic dominance, subjugation, and structural violence. An organization that robs living beings of dignity and freedom to thrive. And because of Sylvie's stubborn, unwavering stance and his newfound compassion, Loki finds himself at an impasse. Like Evelyn in Everything, Everywhere, All at Once, Loki is forced to find another way. It is the quiet power of yin energy in some Eastern traditions. A letting go, which involves the sacrifice of ego, resulting in what some Hindu traditions call seva, selfless service. Loki has been told over and over again that he is destined to lose. That's what Lokis do. His fight for maintaining it all as it is, his attempt to prop up the status quo, keep his friends around, and obtain the glorious purpose he's always wanted, is all a desperate bid to avoid losing. The ultimate irony of this series is that Loki only finds redemption and transformation when he opens his heart and consciously, purposefully, allows himself to lose the game he's been playing. Loki learns to drop the persona mask once and for all and realizes what Jung called the self. The self is the center and wholeness of who we are. It is a totality, nothing split off. This is where true healing occurs. The climactic sequence of the Season 2 finale is chock full of textbook archetypal imagery of the self, which I'll be discussing in more detail later. But the point I want to make right now is that there's a good reason why rationalists and modern-day mainstream psychologists avoid much of Jung's later career work. Because once you scratch beneath the surface, it becomes clear that individuation is not just about personal individual healing, or a method of improving oneself and the status quo. It's not like cognitive behavior therapy, which has proven very useful in equipping people with a clear set of tools and practices that can allow them to just go about their normal life and to become better adjusted to the realities of the status quo. The process of individuation extends beyond the boundaries of psychology. Despite Jung's insistence on his scientific rationality, his use of alchemical terminology, while useful as a psychological metaphor, suggests a deeper, more profound significance. Many pragmatic-minded mainstream Jungians like James Hillman struggled to come to terms with the fact that Jung's work cannot be reduced to status quo strategies. Hillman said in his later years, "I have tried to follow Jung, the psychologist of soul, and not the metaphysician of spirit, and something further is needed. And I've known this for some time. I have been avoiding even working to annul his metaphysics so as not to lose his psychology, but now I realized psychologizing is not enough." Murray Stein, influential Jungian, said the following: "A part of individuation, this increase in consciousness of your own distinctive unique existence as an individual, is coming to yourself in your uniqueness. But there is another aspect to it that's equally important, a spiritual aspect, which is finding yourself. What in the biblical tradition calls an imago Dei, that you are an imago Dei, that you are in the image of God. So where is that God image in you? That is also a part of you, and making that connection between the ego that is functioning in time and space and history, and you are born, you live, you die, you have your problems, and also this other part that is eternal. So, discovering that is also very essential in the individuation process to know what is your basis." I think academic turned esoteric teacher Peter Kingsley was right in his book Catafalque. Jung's psychology wasn't meant to be stripped of its numinous mystery. Jung pointed to the idea that individuation is deification. Whoever does not follow the principium individuationis to its end does not become a god, because he is not able to endure the singleness. And that, when we obtain a complete realization of self, there comes with it the feeling of immortality, a feeling of eternity on this earth. In the Loki series, we have imagery pointing to the fact that Loki hasn't just individuated, hasn't just healed psychologically, but that something deeply mystical, alchemically cosmic, has now occurred. In the alchemical tradition, the tree is also considered to be a symbol of the opus alchemical. Psychologically, it symbolizes the individuation process, that is, the continual inner development toward a higher awareness, in which over and over again new lights are seen. In Norse traditions, the entire cosmos is understood as Yggdrasil, the world tree. This world tree is a powerful image that resonates in various ancient cultures. It is an ancient idea of the axis mundi, the center of the cosmos. While Thor does mention Yggdrasil in his first movie, we see this cosmic world tree motif used differently in the Loki series. Loki's sacrifice at the end of Season 2 leads to the renewal of the world tree, the axis mundi, and the entirety of the cosmos. At the center of the axis mundi, we find Loki, holding it all together, at the roots. This is Loki completing his journey. He started as an egotistical mischief maker and ends up transformed into a symbol of the self. Marie-Louise von Franz writes, "We have seen that the process of individuation is symbolized by the unconscious as a tree, and here we also see a hint of the cosmic man appearing as a plant. The plant represents a lawful process of growth in accordance with a fixed pattern, as well as something that develops directly out of inorganic matter. In a similar fashion, the self also appears as something that grows objectively in the human psyche, beyond all impulses and instincts, as the psychic element in us that stands for continuity and pure being." So with that, let's forgo any semblance of rationalism, and let's now walk through a door into the world of divine mysteries, where ancient ways and almost forgotten divinities exist in an eternal present, for all time, always. The MCU reminds us frequently that Loki is based on a figure from Norse mythology. Loki is the god of mischief, a trickster. The Norse Loki is often spoken of as a quintessential representation of the trickster archetype. I use the term archetypes in a very specific manner, which is slightly different from the most common way the term is used. A Jungian archetype is a specific node of energy within the unconscious mind that displays itself both in physical reality and the reality of the psyche. The closer you get to an archetype, the more one can feel some numinous, divine-like power, but the archetype can never be experienced directly. So archetypes present themselves in our conscious mind using imagery that we can process in some fashion, often in what we refer to as mythological representations. Figures like Coyote and Huehuecoyotl and the ancient Greek Prometheus serve as representations of the trickster archetype. Loki is portrayed in the MCU as a powerful god, but he's just one among many. Their dramas play out in similar fashion to the melodramas of the Greek pantheon. Loki uses deception to his advantage whenever it suits him, and while he leans heavily into his villainous attributes, he never fully loses himself to irredeemable evil. Although he does come pretty close to irredeemable on several occasions, there's often a glimmer of goodness in him, or at least a savvy sense of apathetic disassociation from his villainous acts, like when Loki is a wise ass after being defeated by the Avengers. One gets the feeling that MCU's Loki is always playing a role, but this role fosters pain, suffering, and death. I think the Loki who enters the TVA at the beginning of the series has lost his connection to the deepest, most meaningful aspects of his divinity, his soul. He is indeed a puny god, a supernatural magician, a huckster, a con man, a liar, a cheat, and a thief. His heart is closed. Others are mere pawns in his cunning schemes in his quest for status, meaning, and purpose. But Loki's Norse namesake and other trickster figures like Coyote aren't just rascals causing trouble. They represent a vital aspect of the all-powerful divine force of creation. Many of us have forgotten what ancient traditions understood very well. The divine uses deception and the unsavory aspects of life to alert us to the secrets of God. The Mesoamerican deity Huehuecoyotl, meaning very old coyote, was by some accounts a shapeshifter like Loki. Huehuecoyotl can't quite be pinned down, and it's definitely not to be trusted. But at the same time, seen through a particular lens, the trickster's deception turns out to be the one thing we can actually rely on. That very irony itself is a part of Coyote's trick. I find it interesting that the show has Loki describe two of his methods of trickery: illusion projection and duplication. In ancient Greece, they called this sort of deception apate, and it was considered by some to be a primordial divine force, a force of magical deception. In various Eastern traditions, there is the idea of Maya, the deceptive illusion stemming from the hidden power of creation. C.G. Jung and Marie-Louise von Franz saw this illusory force constellated in dark feminine divinities, as well as the figure of Mercurius, a being revered in hermetic and alchemical traditions. Mercurius has his origins in the Greek god Hermes, who himself was a divine trickster. Mercurius was understood to quicken alchemical transformation. I think an understanding of his ways, and the lessons he embodies, can help one transform the mundane into the transcendent. This creative trickery is very much like the apotropaic pharmacon I mentioned in my previous video. This is the magic of the poison, using deception to awaken us from deception. Peter Kingsley discusses the ancient Greek term metis in his book Reality. Kingsley describes Empedocles as a sorcerer, a perpetual shape-changer, a trickster, a master of illusion who was always showing himself in different forms and guises. And to him, Empedocles was a master of metis. Metis is a form of consciousness that is fully alert, aware, and clever. It detects deception, allows for us to navigate the tricks by becoming a trickster ourselves. The Greek philosopher Gorgias wrote, "He who deceives is more just than he who does not deceive, and he who is deceived is wiser than he who is not deceived." The way of tricksters like Huehuecoyotl can serve to actually awaken us. It teaches us to become pragmatic and alert, to watch out. These trickster figures are often connected to stories of creation or renewal of creation, and I suspect an understanding of the divine ways of the trickster can lead us to an understanding that the whole cosmic fabric of creation is a trick. And I don't mean this just as a nice mystical, metaphysical, or spiritual idea. I mean this literally. Applying our modern scientific ways of thinking lead us right to this same conclusion. Visual illusions can be a helpful shortcut to getting this point across. I like this one where a Coca-Cola isn't made of red pixels, but most people see it as red anyways. I've previously talked about the idea that if you follow rationality and meaning to their logical conclusions, you end up in irrational nonsense, and vice versa. What we experience can be understood as a form of world-creating trickery. Ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus spoke to this idea when he warned that eyesight lies, and that the true ways of the world are hidden. So when we use metis and are alert, adaptive, pragmatic, and clever, we tap into the very fabric of universal creation. According to Kingsley, metis isn't human, it's a borrowed gift from the divine, like Prometheus's fire. And now we come to he who remains. He is one crafty fellow. His metis is second to none. He out-tricks the tricksters. Even Loki complains at one point that the trickery never stops. And Loki outright calls his variant, Victor Timely, a confidence trickster. Throughout the series, He Who Remains has Loki chasing his tail, stuck in a loop of creation, causal time, and space. An Ouroboros, the ancient circular symbol that depicts a serpent devouring its own tail. Loki desperately attempts to learn from a character named Ouroboros. Our protagonist is stuck in a seemingly futile labyrinth of a trickster's making. But within this labyrinth, within this Ouroboros, Loki learns the ways of time, but more importantly, something even more primordial than time itself. In Norse mythology, the concepts of Ouroboros, Jormungandr, and Loki are very much related. The Ouroboros serves as a liminal being, straddling the thin veil between life and death, chaos and order, and destruction and rebirth. Key themes within the Loki series. The Ouroboros holds secrets. The secrets of cyclical time, eternal recurrence, and the true meaning of order. Eventually, Loki learns that the pathway he's looking for is not within causality. It is not within linearity, rationality, or the flimsy veneer of structure and order imposed by a despot ruler. He learns that it has been one great deception. What he was so desperately searching for lay hidden within the very core of his being. Loki has seen through the ways of the cosmic trickster, and now the alchemical solvent that is Mercurius can facilitate Loki's mystical transformation. Finally, seeing this deception for what it is, Loki is forced to awaken to the fact that his true glorious purpose cannot be found within the world of creation, causality, time, and space. Loki is best known within the MCU as an antagonist, and at first glance, such a figure wouldn't really fit in with the other protagonists I've looked at on this channel. I speak a lot about the primordial unifying force that is love. What I haven't discussed overtly is love's counterpart as per Empedocles and other Greek thinkers, Strife, the antagonist. Love and strife are often considered to be opposites, good and bad, positive and negative, hero and villain, or like blind forces of nature, modern-day concepts of like gravity attraction or dark energy expansion. But the originators of these concepts in ancient Greece understood these forces to be divine and interdependent, like the sides of the Mobius strip or four-dimensional Klein bottle, and like yin and yang. Love and strife go with each other. Both are dynamic modes of the divine. Strife isn't necessarily something that is morally or ethically bad. Strife is what makes distinction possible. It reminds me of one of my favorite Alan Watts videos. In it, he discusses the ideas of somethingness and nothingness. I think a key point he makes applies to the idea of love and strife. If it wasn't for strife, there would be no boundaries, there would be no perception of individual things. Strife allows for contrast. Without strife, love merges all things into a distinction-less amorphous sphere, according to Empedocles. Empedocles proposed cycles of love and strife, quite familiar considering modern ideas about the oscillating universe. You'll often find that scholars call love good and strife bad, but I think this is a misunderstanding. The way I see it, the world of distinction created by the interplay of love and strife isn't a scientific principle or a cosmic morality play. It is simply a trick. The cosmos, as Plato describes, is some sort of artistic illusion. According to Parmenides, the ultimate truth is that there are no separate things. There is only one. The world of multiplicity is the way of deception. And if you want to get really weird about it, I think when there is just one, there is actually none at all. Without any distinction, the one can't understand itself in any way. The perception of two is required for any sort of comprehension. So strife can be understood as an illusion of multiplicity, a perception of contrast creating the world of many separate things. As Heraclitus said, all things come into being through strife. And I think this illusion of multiplicity prevents stagnation. It keeps things interesting. In mythological narratives, the trickster often plays the role of disruptor of the status quo. Recently, Alex O'Connor asked physicist Brian Greene the question, "What is time?" Greene said the following, "The way we note that time has evolved is by comparing things. That's how we mark the passage of time by virtue of change. We believe it has to do with entropy, this idea of disorder. We believe that entropy has the tendency to increase over time, to go from order to disorder. That's very simple, and this gives us an insight as to why there's this direction." In hearing him describe time as a process of comparing things and the direction of time as dictated by the movement towards disorder, I couldn't help but think of strife. What I hear in Professor Greene's comments is that strife, through fostering disorder in the cosmos and distinction between things, creates what we call time. In love's unity, there is no time. Strife creates time. This all brings to my mind the Hindu goddess known as Mahakali and Kali. While she has a multitude of formations within different Hindu traditions, Kali is always in some way interrelated with the force of time and with destruction. Kali to me is a unique figure, a Hindu goddess that embodies the dynamic interplay of love and strife, the forces of combination, separation, and reformation. Kali is fierce, she cuts through illusion, but she does so out of a sense of loving devotion. The famous Indian mystic Ramakrishna is reported to have said that Kali, the terrible mother goddess of Hinduism, appears black as long as she is viewed from a distance. When embraced in the soul of her devotee, she is shown to be warm and loving. Strife's work of creating contrast and separation within the cosmos isn't very pleasant. It can be easily labeled as evil, hatred, and unfortunate. Throughout the Loki series, in their own ways, I think Loki, Sylvie, and He Who Remains embody the principle of strife. They take their cues from Norse mythology's Loki, Coyote, Huehuecoyote, and Prometheus, who I think all serve as representations of strife. As painful as strife can be, as tricky as these figures might seem, this strife that creates time and distinction is paradoxically always in service of the Eternal One. Looking at the big picture, strife enables renewal of the cosmos, all in the service of unity. Love and strife are engaged in an intense form of play. But while they may seem different, the inseparability of these opposites hints at an underlying unity. The way I see it, if there is an underlying unity, and unity itself is a principle of love, then all distinctions are union. All distinctions, no matter how vivid, serve love. Strife simply creates tension, like the tension of a string, that allows for musical notes to be played. I think that strife enables the divine play that some Hindu traditions call Leela. If love reigns fully supreme, then there is no one to love, no one to play with, no one to dance with. For love to function as a verb, as an action, it requires two or more. If strife were abolished, the world would cease to exist. Another fascinating paradox is that even just to be able to comprehend the concept of one, there must be distinction. Like modern understandings of gravity and time, everything is relational. You need two to tango. Love requires strife, and strife requires love. It's all quite circular. Hindu guru Neem Karoli Baba once said, "Suffering brings me closer to God." For a good while, I pondered what that meant. One interpretation is the following. Suffering allows us to see that strife, separation, distinction, disruption, disorder is unpleasant, but it is an opportunity nonetheless. According to Kingsley, Jung was quite open in stating that his work was never intended to help people escape their suffering, but was meant to give them the strength they needed to suffer consciously, writing, "Try to apply seriously what I have told you, not that you might escape suffering, nobody can escape it, but that you may avoid the worst blind suffering." Strife provides us with an opportunity to see past illusions of the world. We can see through the illusion of distinction, which means seeing through the illusions of time and space. Empedocles' work implies that it is only in a state of strife that immortality and divinity can be recognized. Despite how awful strife seems, Empedocles trusted in strife. Strife allows one to upgrade one's divine ocular prescription, so to speak, to see this entire spectacle machine for what it is. It's also important to note that fear blocks our view. We can't see the truth when we're afraid. Loki tells Mobius, "I don't enjoy hurting people. I do it because I have to, because it's part of the illusion. It's the cruel, elaborate trick conjured by the weak to inspire fear." And later admits, quote, "I'm scared of being alone. For years now, I've tested the concept that fear is a stubborn resistance to a loss, even if it's an imaginary loss, and so far it's held up pretty well." I think when Loki finally let go of his own fears of being a loser, accepting his destiny fully and completely, he was able to set his gaze towards the eternal, and thus bring about a renewal and rebirth of the One. In ancient Greece, the god Ion was associated with time. But unlike its close counterpart Kronos, Ion wasn't exactly what we consider as time in modern-day parlance. Kronos can be understood as more like chronological time, the time that we use in our daily lives. The difference between the two brings to my mind something that Zen Master Dogen said. Most people think time is passing and do not realize that there is an aspect that is not passing. Ion is a representation of what is beyond time, the timeless eternal depths in which time plays out. Aristotle derived the word ion from a phrase meaning always being, or ever existing, or for all time. He links this to the timeless, utterly still, unchanging nature of an unfathomable celestial realm. Since true eternity, Ion, is timeless and perfect, the manifest world, what we call the physical world, can only reflect itself imperfectly through time, through Kronos. Ion means for all time, always, the TVA slogan. But the TVA isn't Ion, it's a trick. It's a false Ion run by fake divinities. The TVA, created by He Who Remains, functions more like what the ancients called the demiurge, a cosmic craftsman who creates the world we inhabit. Some ancient Greeks described the world of chronological time as an illusion, where an approximation of eternity is sort of projected out from an unmoving, totally still eternity. It's a magic trick, an illusion of motion, time, and space. Aion was often associated with the apparent motions of the zodiac. The rotation of the zodiac can be understood as the passage of time, with the figures of the zodiac marking change. The different archetypal powers represented by the figures of the zodiac rotate. At the hub, so to speak, is Aion in eternal being, in eternal stillness. Plato is often quoted as writing, "Time is a moving image of eternity." Plato was influenced by his time with the Pythagoreans. The Pythagorean tradition had a fascinating relationship to the god Apollo, which I think is very much underplayed, and I'll discuss shortly. Aside from incorporating Pythagorean thought, Plato was also pulling and synthesizing other pre-Socratic philosophy like that of Heraclitus and Parmenides, who, quote, argued that what is whole, immovable, unborn, and imperishable, hence non-temporal, in sharp distinction to what is not, which is literally unthinkable. And similarly, in certain Buddhist traditions, life and death can be considered the moving image of nirvana. This idea brings to mind Loki's explanation of his illusion projection. He defines it as depicting a detailed image from outside oneself, which is perceptible in the external world. That is pretty much what the eternal creator does in Plato's work. It projects a detailed image of itself, perceptible as an external world. This brings to mind the idea of theophany, the human being perceiving images of the divine. Ion had a significant role within later Greek and Roman mystery religions. Ion is portrayed in different ways depending on the tradition, but in the Roman mystery cults of Mithras, he can be seen as a lion-headed being, with a serpent coiled around his body as he holds keys. The serpent imagery itself can be a lengthy tangent, but it's suffice to say, it speaks to the Ouroboros circular nature of time, and perhaps even ties into traditions regarding feminine serpentine creation powers. In the Hermetic Greek magical papyri, Ion is invoked as a deity. Peter Kingsley considers Jung to be an heir to these traditions in some ways. The book Ion was one of Jung's most important late-career works. Kingsley describes how Jung, a man who tried so hard to be respected in the scientific community, had a secret. This psychologist who did such diligent research and argued his viewpoint so rationally had once experienced becoming the deity Ion himself. In his private work, Libre Novus, known as the Red Book, Jung wrote about an experience he had. During an trance-like active imagination, Jung witnessed Christ crucified on a green mountain, and then Jung himself underwent a transformation. I am held fast, and I spread my arms wide. Salome draws near. The serpent has wound itself around my whole body, and my countenance is that of a lion. I see that a terrible and incomprehensible power forces me to imitate the Lord in his final torment. The serpent squeezes my body in its terrible coils, and the blood streams from my body, spilling down the mountainside. Years later, while near death, Jung had an intense experience of eternity. He described being stripped away of his mundane life's baggage, right down to his essence. We shy away from the word eternal, but I can describe the experience only as the ecstasy of a non-temporal state in which present, past, and future are one. Everything that happens in time had been brought together into a concrete whole. Nothing was distributed over time, nothing could be measured by temporal concepts. The experience might best be defined as a state of feeling, but one which cannot be produced by imagination. Here, Jung alludes to the idea that the core of sensation, feeling itself, serves as an entry point for eternity. The pop culture teachings of Be Here Now and the Power of Now speak to this too. Kingsley, through various books and lectures, makes the case that there was an ancient tradition in the early days of Greek philosophy that has been mostly lost to us, but there are tantalizing hints if we look carefully. Using cleverness and metis, we can find the ancient tradition hidden in plain sight. This tradition involved shaman-like travelers coming down from Central Asia and making sacred contact with Pythagoreans, and that contact living on through lineages of initiates. Pythagoras, Empedocles, and Parmenides are closely associated with early understandings of Apollo. In fact, Pythagoras was considered to be an incarnation of Apollo himself. This was a more mysterious form of Apollo, traveling to Greece from a long ways away, a divinity quite different from later conceptions of the quintessential Greek god. The word from which the name Apollo likely originates is apollume. It means to destroy, to make void. This destruction can itself be considered a form of strife. For Kingsley, this ancient world of Apollo is a world of absolute oneness and total awareness. He considered this tradition of Apollo to be the recognition of a divine non-temporal, non-spatial realm that modern physics calls the non-local. It is both all and nothing at once. This ancient practice, the practice of becoming Apollo, the unifying void at the center of the cosmos, might seem familiar to those with knowledge of Eastern mysticism and ideas like Fana in Islamic Sufism. Sci-fi author Philip K. Dick, creator of Blade Runner, The Man in the High Castle, and an inspiration for The Matrix, described Apollo like this: I identify him as Apollo. He appears to different cultures under different names. He can divide himself, and to me, he brought reason. I also think of a Mesoamerican god, referred to as the dual god. This was considered a timeless, eternal god, who was comprised of the union of Lord and Lady of Substance, who in various combinations created the world. There are striking similarities here to the ancient Egyptian creator Atum, the undifferentiated one, who generates the first divine couple. As the One, Atum still belongs to the realm of eternal non-being. Through his transformation into the first divine couple, he enters being. And there's also the relationship between the undifferentiated consciousness of Shiva and dynamic goddess of creation, destruction, and time, Kali, in Kashmir Shaivism. This makes me think of a quote about Buddhist revelation: "I am not in time, because I am time, which therefore means I am free from time." This is Loki at the end of the series. Looking at this from a mystical and alchemical perspective, Loki becomes an archetypal representation of the ancient timeless one behind time. Loki is, for all time, always. Loki is Ion. The word apocalypse in Greek means something like a divine revelation at the end of time. It's a concept not too different from certain spiritual interpretations of the Norse myth of Ragnarok, which is intimately associated with Loki and resonates with mystic ideas about the Last Judgment in Christian traditions. I think our protagonist Loki faced his own apocalypse, his personal Ragnarok, a divine revelation and renewal at the end of time. Loki transformed into Ion, a divine symbol of the self. For Jung, the self is an image of divine wholeness, and one of the recurring images of the self in antiquity was what some ancient traditions called the anthropos. This is an image of a divine primordial human being. Marie-Louise von Franz wrote, "The self is not fully contained within our conscious domain and its temporality. It has a quality of timelessness and ubiquity. Thus, it is often symbolized by a great man who encompasses the entire cosmos. In Indian tradition, this figure is called Purusha, which means person. He exists externally in the cosmos, and also at the same time, as something inner and invisible in each individual human being. All of manifested existence generates from the anthropos. The anthropos, while usually depicted with male features and is often referred to as the divine Adam, is actually a conjunction of opposites. The anthropos is both masculine and feminine, yang and yin, both material and non-material. Our protagonist Loki meets many other Lokis during his journey in existential limbo, but it is only until he bonds with his female opposite that true transformation, true alchemy begins. That bond eventually leads him to a full alchemical transformation. In the series finale, Loki quotes T.S. Eliot's poem Little Gidding, which very much aligns with the show's themes of cyclical time, death, and rebirth. Loki explains that he knows what kind of god he needs to be. He is ready to transform. He's been a trickster, a figure of strife, but now sets out to properly recognize the deeper divinity within. Loki steps onto the platform in an act of self-sacrifice. This sacrificial act, made by a trickster, speaks to Jung's understanding of Mercurius, who enables alchemical transformation. According to Jung, Mercurius was a kind of panacea, savior, and servitor mundi, preserver of the world. Mercurius saves creation from sickness and corruption, just as Christ saved mankind. He sheds his TVA uniform to reveal his formal garb as a green god. This stripping away points at the ancient motif of changing one's garments, which indicates a transformation of state. Loki's iconic horns return, horns which point directly to pagan depictions of the divinity of nature. One such figure was Pan. Kingsley describes the image of God in the following way. God's color is an intense luminescent green, an exquisite emerald color. Here at the center of the cosmos, in the depths of timeless eternity, Loki finds a stone throne, which becomes golden. It's quite the image. A transcendent royal seated on a stone gold-infused throne. This is a powerful image of the divine self. To Jung, stone and gold were symbols of the eternal and imperishable. Marie-Louise von Franz wrote, "The alchemical stone, the lapis, symbolizes something in us that can never be lost and can never dissolve, something eternal, which for this reason is equated by many with the experience of God within us. The golden man sitting on the stone represents the inner man who has gradually become the highest value. Von Franz recounts the last dream that a dying Jung was able to communicate. Quote, "He saw a great round stone in a high place, a barren square, and on it were engraved the words, 'And this shall be a sign unto you of wholeness and oneness.' Then he saw many vessels to the right in an open square and a quadrangle of trees, whose roots reached around the earth and enveloped him, and among the roots golden threads were glittering." Rene Guenon made significant contributions to the study of esotericism, metaphysics, and traditionalism. He wrote about a motif he called the King of the World. He argued that this motif could be found throughout history in various religious and esoteric traditions. For Guénon, this king sits at the center of the cosmos that we reside in, and also simultaneously in an unfathomable realm beyond what we call existence. This king is not just a temporal ruler, but a figure who oversees both the physical and metaphysical realms, uniting them harmoniously. The King of the World provides a new kind of order to existence, a renewal from times of suffering. I want to reiterate that while the term king is most often associated with the masculine, this anthropos figure is a totality. Any differences that appear in the manifested world are all differences within one unified self. Like this Hindu deity, the King of the World is both male and female, and even beyond male and female. Both this King of the World motif and ion are representations of what Jung called the self. Jung had a glimpse of this self when he encountered a green gold Christ in his visions, and he believed it was the same phenomenon spoken of by the hermetic alchemists. He writes, "The green gold is the living quality which the alchemists saw not only in man, but also in inorganic matter. It is an expression of the life spirit, the anima mundi or filius macrocosmi. The emphasis on the metal, however, showed me the undisguised alchemical conception of Christ as a union of spiritually alive and physically dead matter." For generations, these alchemists attempted to turn the mundane into something transcendent. The idealized end result of this process is the alchemical gold of transformation. As he sits on his golden throne, Loki replaces He Who Remains, a despot who oversaw a cosmic kingdom where life was prevented from flourishing, from growing. Life was literally pruned. Like Guénon's King of the World, Loki provides renewal and salvation. In the first episode of the series, Loki proclaims, "I was born to be king," and at the end of the series, he does become king. Just not the one he expected. He becomes the King of Kings. The process Loki goes through in this underworld journey follows an alchemical template, one that had its roots in very ancient Egyptian religious motifs, which were in turn modeled after the solar journey. In ancient Egyptian religious traditions, the dead journey through the darkness of the afterlife, become transformed within that darkness in an identification of some sort with the god Osiris, and arise again to start anew as Horus, son of Osiris. While there are some exceptions and nuances to this, generally speaking, each pharaoh was an incarnation of the god-king Horus. As we'll later see, there are other symbolic resonances between Osiris and Loki. But for right now, I want to explore the alchemical process that took a desperate villainous trickster and turned him into a sacrificial beneficent god-king. Since this video is about Strife in many respects, it's probably on point to bring up the much reviled but knowledgeable esotericist Julius Evola for the first time on this channel. Evola referred to alchemy as the royal art. As discussed in my previous video, Jung publicly used alchemy as a language to describe psychological transformation, although his more esoteric relationship to the subject was kept private. Evola was less hesitant to make personal proclamations about alchemy publicly, writing, "Alchemy is nothing less than a universal secret science of human and natural transformation." Drawing from many esoteric sources, Evola argued that alchemical symbolism, like the Ouroboros, provided a pathway to transcendence. The alchemical ideogram of one the all is the circle, a line or movement that encloses within itself and contains in itself both its end and beginning. In Hermeticism, this symbol expresses the universe, and, at the same time, the great work. Shannon Grimes describes the Ouroboros and its relationship to alchemy in her book Becoming Gold. The Ouroboros, the tail-biting snake whose body encircles the cosmos, is another popular image which represents the regenerative powers of the universe. This cosmic serpent is frequently depicted in Greco-Egyptian alchemical literature, where it appears with inscriptions such as, "The One is the All." Hermeticism is generally understood as an esoteric tradition that teaches what purports to be divine knowledge, or gnosis, rooted in texts like the Corpus Hermeticum. For Evola, the Hermetic royal art creates the transcendent man. The tradition gets its name from a legendary figure based on a combination of the Greek trickster god Hermes and what many ancients considered to be his Egyptian counterpart, Thoth. Hermes Trismegistus is more of a revealer of divine truths than an outright trickster. One attribute of his predecessors that Hermes Trismegistus inherited was his affiliation with divinely inspired writing, which provides initiates into the mysteries with secret knowledge. Which brings to my mind the conundrum of who actually wrote the TVA manual. A Hermeticist could argue Hermes wrote it, and he did so using the Ouroboros to both create the manual and obfuscate its authorship. Grimes writes that alchemist and mystic Zosimos considered Thoth, Adam, Epimetheus, and supreme trickster Prometheus all as representative images of the anthropos, the inner man of spirit. Through the concept of the Hermetic royal art, Evola believed that an initiate could be transformed into the absolute individual, a transcendent godlike state of being. Hermetic philosophy sought to unify an initiate's mind and soul with the fundamental ground of divine being. Grimes explains that a term Zosimos uses for alchemy, the sacred art, is befitting to the art of manufacturing statues of the gods. God-making is the quintessential sacrament of the sacred arts of alchemy and theurgy. In the sacred art, the transformation of matter, corporeal arts, and the transformation of the inner self, spiritual arts, go hand in hand, and ultimately, the goal of each is the union of matter and spirit. The artisans who produce divine statues must purify themselves, perform rituals, and meditate so that their creations are fit for the gods. In doing so, they can realize their own divine nature. For Zosimos, to become spiritually awake, or a man of light as he calls it, is to become gold. Gold was known in Egypt as the flesh of the gods, and it represents divinity. Jung was quite interested in ancient Chinese alchemical traditions, studying the Taoist text, The Secret of the Golden Flower, which he wrote an introduction for. Author Jeffrey Raff explains that in these traditions, one of the goals of alchemy was immortality. Marie-Louise von Franz explains that the adept in the alchemical work creates his own resurrected body during his lifetime. Certain Eastern methods of meditation are also supposed to assist in creating a diamond body, which survives physical death. Evola saw the stages of alchemy, including the ones covered in my previous video on Nosferatu, as a sort of yogic practice, where the practitioner starts with a dissolution of one's ego and worldly attachments, then refining themselves until they reach the state of a final union of the opposites, unifying both the masculine principle and feminine principle. At this point, an immortal divine consciousness awakens. Thinkers like Evola, Guenon, and others point to esoteric traditions in many cultures around the world, looking for similar pathway markers on the road to divine revelation. This exercise isn't always received well, but I understand the impulse. Although exact one-to-one comparisons may not always exist, mystical traditions often share notable parallels. Pythagoras wasn't the only ancient Greek figure who was considered a divine being. Empedocles also considered himself an immortal being, and boasted he was recognized as a god by followers. Tibetan Buddhism has deep roots in the shamanic traditions of Central Asia. So naturally, you'll find esoteric practices of deification, some of which have only been made public in recent history. In other forms of Buddhism, you'll find traditions of transformation into Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. And one could argue that Hinduism is pretty much centered around discourses and practices regarding divine transformation, with sages like Ramana Maharshi and Neem Karoli Baba being understood as the divine godhead operating through a human body. In Jewish tradition, you have the figure of Enoch, who is said to have been taken up into heaven by God, then transformed into a figure that some considered the second Jehovah. Jewish mystics consider it possible for a practitioner to undergo transformation and achieve union with the Godhead. In Islam, you'll find traditions of prophets achieving transcendent states, and Sufi mystics focused explicitly on unification with God. In Christianity, Jesus is portrayed as a divine figure living among humanity on earth, and he is quoted as telling his followers that they are gods. Those are just some examples in the realm of religious mystic tradition. In pop psychology, Maslow's hierarchy of needs is often taught as a framework for achieving the goal of self-actualization. But later in life, Maslow updated his thinking to include transcendent peak experiences, saying, "Transcendence refers to the very highest and most inclusive or holistic levels of human consciousness." And lastly, going back to Jung, Kingsley seems to argue that Jung's paradigm of individuation, often misunderstood and taught as a program to become the best version of oneself, is actually a process of deification. Jung wasn't just talking in poetic metaphors, but he was excessively cautious about revealing too much about this, including his transformation into Ion, fearing it might jeopardize whatever social standing he had left in polite society. The Orphic tradition considered the god Fa-Nes to be the first ruler of the cosmos, the original universal king, an image which resonates with Guénon's King of the World. Kingsley and Stein have both looked at the influence of ancient Greek Orphic traditions on Jung. In this discussion, they briefly touch on the influence that Fa-Nes has on Jung's Red Book, which led its editor to claim quite bluntly that Fa-Nes is Jung's god. Kingsley gets an audible gasp out of Stein when explaining how some scholarship convincingly argues that Fa-Nes is a mythological predecessor for Ion. Fa-Nes is Ion, and there's evidence that Jung understood that to be the case. The implication here is startling. It means that Jung's deification experience transforming into Ion was a deification experience of transformation into the cosmic ruler of the world, and his book Ion wasn't just an empirical historical inquiry into the intellectual concept of the self. It's also Jung's mystic autobiography. Kingsley recounts an anecdote from Jungian Jolanda Jacobi. On one occasion, she had a dream in which Jung appeared to her as a god figure. On telling him the dream, he replied, "So now you know who I am." Both Kingsley and Evola make reference to the legend of the Holy Grail, a tradition intimately intertwined with these themes of divinization, individuation, and the royal art through which one fully realizes the King of the World. Kingsley writes that for Jung, the function of both the Gnostic crater and the later Grail is to give direct access to death, the underworld, and the unconscious. Evola writes, "This quest is essentially an inner event. As an experience, it does not amount to some mere mystical ecstasy. It is rather a primordial power that is positively evoked." Evola also discusses the possible origins of the Grail narrative, and that although it seems like a through-and-through Christian legend, there is substantial and often convincing speculation about the Grail story coming from an amalgamation of various older pagan alchemical traditions. After facing the void, the syzygy arrives at the citadel at the end of time. I believe this citadel can be understood as a representation of, or at least a nod to the legendary Grail Castle. In Grail legend, the Grail Castle is situated in a cosmic realm, outside of normal time and space, bringing to mind the ancient tradition of the seventh heaven. Sometimes the castle is described as invisible and unreachable. Only the elect can find it, either out of sheer chance or through a magical spell, since it usually vanishes from the sight of its seekers. The custody of the Grail and of its seat is about the defense of a certain spiritual center. The seat of the Grail always appears as a castle or fortified regal palace. In Loki, the citadel's tower is Grail-like, glowing golden. In most Grail legends, one finds an ailing ruler of the old order inside the Grail Castle. He keeps the secret of the Grail under wraps, as the world outside falls into disrepair. He who remains, and his desire to renew his kingdom, isn't a perfect representation of the sick and ailing Grail King of legend, but certainly a riff on the idea. The Grail Knight's quest is to find the Grail and renew the world once again. For Evola, this tale is an initiation. Speaking of the Grail legend, he wrote, "This has or is susceptible of having the character of a mystery in the initiatory sense of the word." The mystery of the royal art is strictly related to that of the heroic reintegration. This is explicitly stated, for instance, in a text in which the central theme consists in the identification of the heroes with those who succeed in conquering the second tree of life, and in introducing a second earthly paradise, an image of the primordial center. This center, like the Grail's castle, does not appear to base and impure souls, but remains hidden in the celestial spheres of the inaccessible light of the heavenly sun. It shows itself only to the happy magical hero, who alone gloriously possesses it, enjoying the salvific tree of life located in the middle of this universe. The ancient traditions I mentioned earlier, whether it be the Pythagorean Apollo tradition, the Hermeticists, the Islamic mystics, the Greek and Roman mystery cultists, all had initiatory practices and mystery narratives that held together their beliefs. Nowadays, we call a lot of this material mythology, but for the ancients, these stories were the glue that held together traditions, passing on esoteric knowledge from generation to generation. I find it interesting that the Loki's journey within this series has parallels not only to the Duat journey in the Egyptian religion, but to ancient mystery initiation practices. In this Grail citadel, the two Lokis confront he who remains, the ruler who looks to use their quest for his own purposes, to renew his method of ruling the cosmos. Evola writes about resonances between the Grail legend and Hermeticism. In Hermeticism, the terms gold, sun, and king were regarded as synonymous and used interchangeably. Aside from this, the development of the opus hermeticum was often portrayed in the form of a sick king who eventually heals, or of a king or a knight laying in a coffin or a tomb who is finally resurrected, or of an old and decrepit man who gains back vigor and youth, or of a king who is stricken, sacrificed, or killed, but who later acquires a higher life and a stronger power than any man who preceded him. I think this general dynamic applies to the relationship between Loki and He Who Remains. Through his guiding hand, He Who Remains initiates Loki into the mysteries, into unlocking divine powers that Loki couldn't dream of, in order for him to, in some way, renew the status quo. But in this particular Grail story, Loki refuses to complete the final step in his formal training once he reaches the Grail Castle. The final step would involve killing Sylvie. But Loki puts love and compassion above his own desire for raw power. And it is this that completes his alchemical purification into a cosmic deity. This becomes his true initiation into the deepest mysteries. This kind of otherworldly help is very much needed if the knights are to find the Grail and successfully undergo a series of adventures and symbolic duels. Incidentally, the latter express the same process of purification that in Dante's work took the form of a journey through hell and purgatory. After listening carefully to Sylvie, Loki understands what he has to do. Loki says, "I know what I want. I know what kind of god I need to be. For you. For all of us." Instead of sacrificing someone he loves to achieve his goals, Loki sacrifices himself. This shift speaks to a deeply esoteric aspect of many mystery cult rituals, where one must undergo a sense of ritual, mock sacrificial death in order to arrive at transcendence. According to Aristotle, those who are being initiated in the mysteries weren't necessarily there to learn something, but rather to, quote, suffer some change, to be put in a certain condition, to be fitted for some kind of purpose. And the core of Buddhist understanding is the Buddha's first noble truth, the realization that suffering must be clearly seen and understood before proceeding along the path to enlightenment. In Native Plains traditions, we find the practice of the sun dance, in which a center world tree serves as the axis mundi, around which participants sacrifice themselves in various ways in order to renew creation. The image of Loki walking down the platform as his clothing strips away can be understood as an alchemical, hermetic transformation of states. The hermetic text, the key, says that soul is the garment of mind, and spirit is the garment of the soul. The purified mind eventually strips its spirit and soul garments and puts on a fiery tunic, in which it ascends to the noetic realms. We see a light shine in the darkness. The climax of the Eleusinian Mysteries involved such an experience. Richard Seaford explains that initiates wandered around in fear, sweating and in distress, in darkness, then get bathed in a beautiful light. This is the moment initiates become initiated. And Grimes writes, Hermetic texts describe the process of inner illumination as a means of becoming God. In Poimandres, for example, the initiate sees an endless vision in which everything became light clear and joyful, and in seeing the vision, I came to love it. After the light is identified as the mind of God, the initiate is told that this divine light is identical with his own mind. As Roger Penrose told Mark Vernon, light particles do not experience time. So in his view, to be bathed by light is to be bathed by eternity. This light is a sign that Loki is now entering the true eternal, and I think this resonates with the esoteric ancient idea of the black sun, which can be found in the depths of darkness. In ancient Egyptian traditions about afterlife journeying, the nocturnal sun shines on the dead, awakening them to new life. The sun's journey gives visible proof that light can be reborn in darkness and the body in death. The light turns into an opening. This opening is, I think, pretty obviously a symbol of the divine feminine. This shape is used in many traditions. One notable example is medieval Christian art. According to Ptolemy, the Gnostic, we come to Gnosis by being initiated into the mysteries of the Mother. Loki now enters into the deepest realms of Maya, of the feminine matrix of creation. He does through an act of surrender, which itself is the feminine principle at work. As he steps into the center of the cosmos, we find symbols of the self. Evola writes, "These are first and foremost symbols of centrality. The center, the pole, the region in the middle of the earth, the central stone or the foundation, the magnet. Then symbols of stability, the island surrounded by the waters, the rock, the unshakable stone. Finally, symbols of inviolability and inaccessibility, the invisible or not to be found castle or land, a wild mountain peak, a subterranean region. Other symbols point to life in the higher sense of the word." But let me stop here for a moment and consider that perhaps this has all gone too far into the deep end. Maybe I can pull this back a bit and talk more soberly about the psychological view of the symbolism found in Loki's journey. For example, we could look at Richard Rohr's work with men's groups, where he refers to the Grail legend as a form of psychological healing, where the powers of toxic patriarchy can be transformed in a more healthy masculinity. From this perspective, he who remains as Grail King represents that old toxic top-down patriarchy, a patriarchy that manipulates, overpowers, and subjugates his female counterparts, like the way he who remains betrayed his partner Renslayer. This is patriarchy that uses power for power's sake, relying on technologies of death to maintain superiority. And Loki himself was once representative of that toxic hierarchical thinking too. Proclaiming in Avengers 1, "The unspoken truth of humanity is that you crave subjugation, a mad scramble for power and identity." You also have the popular work of Robert Moore, who speaks of finding the king within the male psyche. Moore comes from what I sense is a pragmatic, Jungian-inspired point of view, so it is possible to look at this show from a less mystic, more psychological and practical perspective. It definitely works. And honestly, it would be super convenient if I could just drop all the esoteric stuff, because I find it is a challenge to speak about the sacred masculine. Since our society has devalued the feminine principle for so long and so blatantly, it's sort of easy to identify and discuss what has been lost. In the status quo, the concept of the masculine has been co-opted by hierarchical patriarchal structures of dominance. In my opinion, the idea of a masculine principle has become tainted and associated with harmful status-seeking and controlling dominance games. And this approach to life, forcing chaos into order by reinforcing dominance hierarchies, isn't exclusive to people of the male gender. It is in the water, so to speak, and it taints how we all operate in some degree. Renslayer is a good example of this, she proclaims. "All that matters is order versus chaos, and I'm order." Also, it's challenging to talk about this because I think that for the masculine to become sacred, it must paradoxically be rooted in the sacred feminine. No matter how well-intentioned one might be, if the sacred feminine isn't honored, then the sacred masculine cannot arise. How strong can a tree be without water? You can see this in the Loki series. Loki realizes his newfound powers won't fix the patriarchal status quo no matter how hard he tries. In order for the status quo to continue, he must kill Sylvie, tame the unruly feminine. Instead, he listens to her and refuses to kill her out of deep compassion. This is honoring the sacred feminine, and this allows him to take ultimate responsibility to protect those he loves, an act that honors the sacred masculine. Loki enters the sacred feminine portal, completing his entry into the world of mysteries. Through an alchemical process, Loki does ultimately replace he who remains, but not by following in his footsteps. Loki lowers his sword, his desire for domineering power, and he is taken down to a place within himself where he can honestly say, "The last thing I want is a throne." This paradoxically gets him a throne as king of the world. He would not be able to take the yang act of grasping and binding the roots of existence through sheer masculine force, without first having firm footing within yin, the feminine. And one part of that is actually taking a quiet moment to really listen to Mobius, a man who has come to terms with responsibility. You're not going to find comfort at the TVA. Most purpose is more burden than glory. And trust me, you never want to be the guy who avoids it, because you can't live with the burden. There's no comfort. You just choose your burden. So Loki goes from trickster to a powerful symbol of taking ultimate responsibility, not through patriarchal domination, but through receptivity and sacrifice of ego. That all works, and it's great. And if that's how someone prefers to use Jung's work, the esoteric material as psychological metaphor, more power to them. But I think Peter Kingsley is right in Catafalque. These waters run deep, maybe deeper than most want to go, or even can go right now. In an interview with spiritual teacher Adyashanti, Kingsley explains, Jung said that individuation is not only the goal of the Grail quest, it is the Grail. He compared individuation to finding the Grail, but he said, this is when you have surrendered everything you have to. Jung starts speaking as a Christian mystic, where he says the process of individuation is hell. There is nothing more lonely, there is nothing more solitary, there is nothing quite as painful, because it is a process of dying. It is the process of surrendering oneself to the impersonal. This is the typical language of the German mystics. You can surrender yourself to the impersonal. Sufi sage Ibn al-Arabi demonstrated through his own life the paradox of how, after the state of oneness with God, comes the stage of becoming God's humble servant. In Norse mythology, a pair of humans survive in the world tree, Yggdrasil, after the Ragnarok apocalypse. Jung wrote about the relationship of the union of the opposites to the symbol of the tree. The alchemist saw the union of opposites under the symbol of the tree, and it is therefore not surprising that the unconscious of present-day man, who no longer feels at home in his world and can base his experience neither on the past, that is no more, nor on the future, that is yet to be, should hark back to the symbol of the cosmic tree rooted in this world and growing up to heaven, the tree that is also man. In the history of symbols, this tree is described as the way of life itself, a growing into that which eternally is and does not change, which springs from the union of opposites, and by its eternal presence also makes that union possible. After Loki and Sylvie have their final exchange at the end of time, Loki harnesses the power of nature to transform the status quo into a life-nurturing system. This results in a TVA that no longer prunes branches, no longer ends nature's growth. It becomes an organization tasked with ensuring that the tree of life grows and flourishes, creating a new kind of order in harmony with nature. Evola writes about this tree. One of the symbols that we encounter in diverse traditions, remote in both time and space, is that of the tree. Metaphysically, the tree expresses the universal force that spreads out in manifestation, the same way that the plant energy spreads out from its invisible roots to the trunk, branches, leaves, and fruit. Consistently associated with the tree are, on the one hand, ideas of immortality and supernatural consciousness, and on the other, symbols of mortal, destructive forces and frightening natures, such as dragons, serpents, or demons. There also exists a whole cycle of mythological references to dramatic events in which the tree plays a central part, and in whose allegory profound meanings are hidden. Loki becomes the Green Man at the center of the cosmos. The image of the Green Man pops up in many traditions, and although they're not necessarily connected by culture and time, they do seem to point to a transcendent figure not bound to space and time who understands the secret ways of nature. There's a constellation of images and ideas here that I'd like to do a quick tour of. The most well-known Green Man is a figure often found in English churches and cathedrals. This figure is typically depicted as a face surrounded by or made of foliage. Some argue this imagery has deep roots in pre-Christian pagan traditions, though others dispute this. Regardless, the image is now associated with nature, death, fertility, and rebirth. Another Green Man is the venerable figure of Khidr in Islam. According to some, he was originally a sort of vegetation spirit in whose footprints plants and flowers were said to magically sprout. While not everyone considers him a trickster, he is sometimes characterized as such. Von Franz wrote that he appears as an unknown wanderer on the earth in the guise of trickster and tester of men. Either way, it's fair to say that there's often more to the story than initial appearances. He taught Moses using unexpected disturbing methods. He is understood to be an immortal guide for all seeking spiritual knowledge. He is available to those who call upon his help. Daniela Boccassini refers to him as the green and greening one. Jung's Red Book guru Philemon referred to himself as Kidder. She points out that Jung seems to equate him to Philemon and Phanes, who is also known as Ion, arguing that this is related to the radical aliveness of the world and its intrinsic birthing or germinating power. This brings to mind the greening force that Christian visionary Hildegard von Bingen wrote about. Tom Cheetham notes, in accordance with Islamic iconography, the color of the final stage, in transformation, is emerald green. Evola writes about one variation of the Grail legend, which may have connections to pagan Norse religion. It concludes with an emperor who lives and does not live, one with the sprouting branches and yet standing apart from the new shoots. I find it interesting that the Holy Grail, so often represented as a golden chalice, was in some versions a green gem. Von Franz wrote about a Chinese primordial creation entity named Pangu, who is sometimes depicted with horns and sometimes depicted covered with leaves like a plant. He is a unity that arises as a living growth, that simply exists. In the mystery religion of Orphism, it was said that ivy leaves and vine tendrils envelop the practitioners of Dionysiac worship and unite them with the powers of nature. Now shifting gears to a more playful green man, I'd like to also mention the vegetation spirit Mescalito, associated with ceremonial use of peyote. I've always enjoyed Robert Anton Wilson's anecdote about looking up from gardening to see Mescalito dancing in a nearby cornfield. Rudolf Steiner, founder of anthroposophy, stressed the sacred significance of gardening and farming for us moderns. During underworld explorations documented in the Red Book, Jung's soul told him to be content and cultivate your garden with modesty. 2 videos in a row, we've arrived at the idea of sacred agriculture. In native traditions, agricultural practices are considered sacred, and this belief carried over to early civilization. I'm particularly interested in the role of sacred agriculture in mystery cult traditions. In the influential Egyptian religion, Osiris, known for his death and rebirth narrative, was considered a vegetation god. In fact, he was called the Lord of the Abundant Green. Western culture's tradition of columns started as a practice of artistically rendering sacred agriculture in Egyptian temples. According to Jeremy Nadler, evidence indicates that in Mesopotamia and Egypt, gardening was practiced in a sacred context, for in both cultures, the most important and spectacular gardens belonged to the temples. Empedocles used agricultural language in his teaching. The mysteries at Eleusis were very much agrarian in nature. Jesus used agricultural language in his teaching as well. The Gospel of John refers to Christ as the true vine and God the Father as gardener. Meister Eckhart, a Christian mystic, considered the formless Godhead to be like a sacred field. It is of note that the Christian passion narrative begins in a garden. In the Abrahamic faiths, the tree of life grows in the Garden of Eden. This is paradise as described in the book of Genesis, where the primordial anthropos, the hermaphrodite Adam Kadam, pairs off into the divine coupling we know as Adam and Eve. In Eckhart's commentary on Genesis, he wrote, "In this field, the seed of eternity is sown. Here, the plough of intellect cannot reach, for it is unploughed, and yet bears all things. And our very soul, our very being, is like a soil that can be tilled. The seed of God is in us. Given an intelligent and hard-working farmer, it will thrive and grow up to God, whose seed it is, and accordingly, its fruits will be God nature. Pear seeds grow into pear trees, nut seeds into nut trees, and God seed into God. And out of this transcendent field, out of the ground of our own very being, divinity could be birthed. What good is it to me if Mary gave birth to the Son of God 1400 years ago, and I do not also give birth to the Son of God in my time and in my culture? We are all meant to be mothers of God." Another Christian thinker, the Egyptian Gnostic Valentinus, taught that the divine origin arises from male and female pairs. The first and most significant pair is the deep father and silent womb mother. Once the deep had the idea of emitting out of himself the beginning of everything like a seed, and he deposited this emission as if into a womb. Silence received this seed and became pregnant and gave birth to consciousness, and she gave birth to civilizations and everything else. For Valentinus, God was not one, but two, a dyad. It is only through the dyad that the one can experience itself. While this all sounds quite poetic and transcendent, in fact this is very much rooted in agricultural traditions going back into prehistory. Quite literally, our concept and use of time itself originates from agricultural practices. These agricultural practices then developed into or alongside religious beliefs. And looking at the Loki series, there's an interesting analog which may feel very obscure or like overreach, and I think it's a bizarre point to make, but I think it's important to this conversation about sacred farming. So heads up, we're now getting weirder. In order to become Ion, the timeless at the center of the cosmic tree of creation, Loki had to master what OB, Ouroboros himself, called time-slipping. Throughout Season 2, Loki is afflicted with a painful-looking chaotic condition where he turns into a screaming blob as he's teleported to a different coordinate within time and space. Mobius tells Loki, "It looks like you're being born or dying or both at the same time," which is a spot-on-point description of Loki's alchemical deification process as an Egyptian underworld journey. At first, Loki has no control over the time slips, but as he increases in knowledge and power through his journey, Loki turns the howling, painful, chaotic, time-slipping into a purposeful act of navigation. And this newfound mastery of time and space is marked by a deep breath. This change from chaotic screaming and random time-slipping to a calm breathing practice brings to my mind the ancient Egyptian phenomena of books of breathing, which were sometimes attributed to the powerful Egyptian goddess Isis, consort of Osiris, and sometimes to the god Thoth. These texts helped guide the dead through the afterlife journey. The deceased learns to breathe eternally and become divine with the souls of the gods. And it's worth noting that in Islam, Khidr, the green one, is sometimes referred to as the breath of life. Loki's first couple of controlled time slips happen as he poses with his hands raised, looking at his palms. This deep breathing practice is reminiscent of breath-based meditation techniques in Buddhist, Hindu, and Islamic Sufi mysticism, as well as Groff's modern holotropic breathwork. Eventually, Loki's teleportations happen more naturally once he gets the hang of it, but they're always directed by compassion for those he loves. As odd as it might sound, I think this is related to this practice of sacred agriculture. The way I see it, Loki is planting himself in the timeless. Each directed time slip further roots him in the realm of the eternal. Time then becomes a plaything to him. In Kingsley's words, "Immortality is found in the middle of mortality. The purpose of human existence is to become farmers and planters of eternity inside us." Real spiritual work means becoming gardeners. This is why the origin of the word paradise is a walled or closed-in garden. Loki's time-slipping can be understood as an analog for the ancient practice of rooting oneself into the present moment through the use of the body's sensory system. A traditional image of this is the Buddha's hand touching the ground, indicating his earth grounding in something other than the illusions of this world. Empedocles called the senses palms, like the palms of one's hands. He called for us to open our palms, meaning open up the senses, so that we can see reality for what it is. He called the elements of existence the eternal roots, and Jung similarly referred to one's eternal unchanging nature as the rhizome. The lives we live as individuals are like the plant above ground, von Franz elaborates. The plant always has a part of itself hidden in the earth, and the image of the plant in the human psyche points to the fact that we too have a part of us that participates in life as a whole that remains hidden from us. The paradigm is something like this. Our experiences in time are like the trunk and branches of a tree. The soil these experiences grow in is our sensation, and our roots below the soil are comprised of the deep unseen realm that is eternity. According to the Buddha, the only way we can experience reality is through the sensory system we have available to us. Looking at the Buddha's discourses in the Pali Canon, consciousness can be best understood as the simple cognitive experience of being aware of what is arising in our sensory field. The Buddha said, "When walking, one knows they are walking. When standing, one knows they are standing," and so on. There is a link or contact point between attention and the sensory experience called phassa. There's a lot of talk in New Age or yoga circles about the present moment. What I think is very often missed is that the present moment isn't a concept. It is not something one thinks about or believes in. The true present moment is only experienced through the body, through its sensory apparatus. It is an experience you fully embody. Through still embodied observation, one can observe the manifested sensory world, Sacred Mother Maya. This observation leads these perceptions back to their origin in the infinite awareness, known as the Sacred Father. The mystical secret here is that the basis for all the distinct senses, the ground of sensation, is itself eternal and timeless. Wherever you go, whenever you are, sensation remains. No matter what time it is, what age you are, whatever you are doing, sensation remains. If you consciously lock into that sensation, you might notice that time and space feel more malleable. I suspect that the practice of esoteric farming, of cultivating eternity in oneself, through fully engaging the senses and through quiet stillness, provides the divine with a very special type of offering. In hermetic writings, one finds symbols referring to seed, field, and flowering. Evola's way of talking about this is a bit archaic, but luckily, Cynthia Bourgeault describes the overall process from a high level, and I think she summarizes it beautifully. I think the real purpose of this unique world as it lives at the junction, at the cross-tree with this other, is really acted out in an alchemy between the timeless and time. So we have to get in this world bound in time, and we have to become fully a part of this time-bound experience. And so we fall into forgetfulness. But having fallen mercifully into forgetfulness, we then need to move into waking up again, so we can take the fruit of our finite life, which we live here, and transform it with the alchemy of our conscious attention, and offer it back to the divine as a part of divine realization. We don't get realized in this journey. God gets realized. It is through this process that the mundane world that most of us inhabit becomes a new earth. The biblical tradition of a new earth speaks of a transformational renewal of the cosmos. And here in this new earth, we find the tree of life. If you can walk and be aware of the sensation of your own body, this ground, this soil, this deep primordial foundation inside, and at the same time, being aware through meters of all the sense activity around you, the beauty, the sounds, the silence, in doing those two things together, bringing the sensation and the senses together, you become the tree of life. By accepting the lowest in myself, I lower a seed in the ground of hell. The seed is invisibly small, but the tree of life grows from it and conjoins the below and the above. You make yourself into the vessel of creation in which the opposites reconcile, and thus you also serve others. This knowledge of the heart is in no book, but grows out of you like the green seed from the dark earth. You will hold the invisible realm in trembling hands. It lowers its root into gray darknesses and mysteries of the earth, and sends up branches covered in leaves into the golden air. It will stay green for a long time. We should all consider what kind of garden we are growing with our lives. The Loki series pretty explicitly addresses the relationship between chaos and order. Usually when this overwrought theme comes up in mass media, I roll my eyes. But I think the Loki series addresses this in a special way, very much aligned with the broader esoteric ideas I've been discussing. For those who have experienced existential chaos firsthand, it's very logical to strive for and maintain some semblance of order. The clash between chaos and order is a very common theme when it comes to discussion of the masculine. You'll find this in the work of the popular Jordan Peterson, where he advocates for order to be carved out of chaos, using the analogy of a dragon that must be vanquished by a hero. But in the Loki series, and in various alchemical traditions, the dragon is understood as the Ouroboros. It cannot be conquered. That doesn't work. There's no solution that will slay this dragon. And as we go around in circles, the question inevitably arises, what kind of order are we talking about here anyways? Is it the hierarchical order of dominance represented by he who remains? The status quo has been creating this kind of garden since the beginning of history. It is a cultural growth that I think is pretty obviously reaching a breaking point. Is it possible to try a new organic growth? A different sort of culture, a new sort of time, that grows from the dark depths of timeless eternity. There's a Buddhist refrain about how the iconic lotus flower grows from the mud, no lotus. As Jeremy Nadler writes, there are basically two tensions in gardening, allowing nature to be itself and controlling nature, making sure it complies with our personal requirements. This tension is represented by the contrast between He Who Remains and Green Man Loki as his successor. We see both of them watch the cosmos from the end of time, but one does so through top-down violent control, while the other becomes nature itself. I think the Loki Season 2 finale points the way. The final image of the series is Loki watching. He Who Remains told him, "Every moment of peace you've ever experienced was yours because I was here, at the end of time, keeping watch." And that role is now Loki's. But Loki's watch is not the cold domineering of a despot, but instead the gaze of a calm, benevolent, eternal God within the heart of nature. The English word watch, of course, is very much related to the concept of time. We physically watch our watches. A watch or clock can be understood as a representation of the divine self. The center hub is the ever-present timeless ion. The movement of the hands represents ion's ever-shifting gaze, which creates the illusion of motion. This resonates with Sufism's fascinating use of the compass and pen to create a depiction of transcendent cosmic principles. Some call these configurations archetypes, the zodiac. In the ancient Chinese tradition, they're the bagua. In I Ching divination, one doesn't try to predict the future. One is essentially asking a question to the universe: what kind of time is it right now? Not time in terms of like regular clock time, but time in a qualitative sense, like when we say, "It's time to get proactive," or "This is the time to relax." The I Ching will provide one of 64 hexagrams to let one know what kind of time it is. I consider Ion like an eye in the middle of the bagua, still and eternal, watching creation transform itself into various image combinations, like looking through a rotating kaleidoscope. The clock speaks to the cyclical nature of these image transformations. The word watch is related to the idea of watchmen, those whose role it is to stay awake and vigilant. So the very act of watching a watch can be understood to be an analogy for how an awakened being observes the ever-shifting configurations of time. The Corpus Hermeticum explains, God makes Ion. Ion makes the cosmos makes time. The concept of watching is an ancient one that intersects with several traditions in interesting ways. The highest stage of initiation within the Eleusinian mysteries was called beholding or overseeing, and the highest grade initiates referred to as watchers. In ancient Jewish tradition, you'll find narratives about the watchers. I understand that Marvel has its own watchers, which bear some superficial similarities to these biblical figures. The vigilant holy watchers of the ancient Jewish tradition were angelic beings tasked with watching and teaching humanity, that is, until a group of them went rogue. What became of them is written about in the books of Enoch. Enoch was a Hebrew prophet who was transformed into a divine being, attaining the closest possible existence to God, even sitting on his own throne in the heavens. I think it's fair to say Enoch surpassed the watchers in glory, and not too much of a stretch to say he became something like the ultimate most holy watcher. There are groups within the Jewish tradition such as Kabbalists and Hasidic practitioners that work to experience union with the divine. In some of these traditions, this diagrammed tree of life provides pathways towards such union. The word yoga means union. In the Hindu Upanishads, it is taught that the Atman, the individual soul, is identical to Brahman, the ultimate infinite formless reality, the ground of all being. For many Hindus, the receiving of darshan is foundational. Darshan is a moment of divine sight, which provides grace to the practitioner. One can get darshan in different ways, like visiting temple deities and being in the presence of a true guru. Having spent time in Hindu environments, it sounds quite absurd to say this, but by definition, this image is Loki's darshan. In Sufi traditions, you'll find the practice of muraqabah. In ancient Arabic, the word muraqabah referred to one who would watch the night sky, and it has come to mean to guard and watch over. This practice is often referred to as Sufi meditation. It is considered an Islamic methodology through which a human can experience transcendent union with the divine. In various Eastern traditions, you'll find the concept of the third eye, which provides perception beyond ordinary sight. And the Buddha, the awakened one, taught that right vision is necessary for self-realization. The Hermetic tradition speaks of the heart as the organ of perception, and Zosimos recommended a form of still meditation as the most straightforward method for summoning the divine. Christ, the most well-known representation of the king at the center of the world, the King of Kings, emphasized the importance of watching. Keep watch, because you do not know on what day your Lord will come. In what is probably Meister Eckhart's most famous quote, he said, "The eye with which I see God is the same eye with which God sees me. My eye and God's eye is one eye, and one sight, and one knowledge, and one love." This connection between watching and loving compassion can also be found in Buddhism, Hinduism, Judaism, and Islam. And I think you can see a softening in Loki's face at the end of the series. His watch is that of a compassionate being. His watch is loving. In esoteric terms, this is the sacred Lord's awareness, the awareness that watches the sacred lady's sensory display called the cosmos. Each and every moment of alert awareness is a sacred union of the opposites. Awakened observation of the present moment is itself hieros gamos, divine sexual union. This is the union of the motionless ever-present called the eternal, and the illusory moving images called time. I'll now come clean. This video has been a trick. Clickbait, if you will. It's actually not about the MCU or all these dusty, mostly forgotten ancient names, stories, and beliefs. This video is about you. The moment you're living right now, listening to these words, looking at a screen, feeling clothing and air on your skin, the smell of the room, the sounds of the birds, the taste in your mouth. This is alchemy. The conjunction of the watcher and the watched is God. God is a verb. What we call God is the dynamic interplay between the seed of observance and the soil of creation. God is the flower that blooms. And when this is fully recognized, like really seen through first-person experience, the entire enterprise collapses in on itself. It's just one of Loki's tricks, but I can't blame you if you don't believe me. Coyote is very clever. The illusion is very convincing, and it demands participation. And honestly, it's perfectly fine to keep playing the illusory game. But I am under obligation to let you know about the party. Sit quietly, once a day, without distractions. This is standing watch. Open the senses. Feel, listen, smell, look, taste. Go about your day. Repeat. This is the good news. You might begin to notice something peculiar about who is watching, and you just might remember something that you have forgotten. Don't take my word for it. Find out for yourself.